The road to the farmhouse looked like a vein on a dead hand, straight, pale, and empty. I drove it anyway, because the deed had my name and the lawyer's voice on the phone had sounded like relief. "It's all yours," he'd said, like a burden passed mid-stride. When I turned off the county lane, the fields didn't wave, they lay flat, bristled with sun-scorched stubble. Not a whisper of green. The house itself, 2 stories, paint scabbed, windows dim, watched me approach as if it had eyes beneath the eaves. I killed the engine and let the silence bloom. Summer heat pressed its palm over my mouth. On the porch, a horseshoe hung upside down, luck spilling out, my mother would have said. I reached for the door and saw a smear on the jamb, brown-black, like someone had dragged 2 fingers there and never wiped them clean. My uncle's house. My inheritance. My problem now. Inside smelled of old wood and a memory of smoke. The rooms were staged in that strange pause death leaves behind, a mug ring on the kitchen table, a calendar stuck on August, a chair turned halfway toward the window as if someone had heard a sound and never sat back down. I caught myself whispering, "Hello," to whatever echo had been living here longer than me. I found the fields from the back stoop. Up close, the soil wasn't soil. It was the color of pencil lead, clumped and fine, and when I crouched to pinch a handful, it left a residue on my fingers that tasted, stupidly, yes, I put it to my tongue, faintly metallic. The horizon wavered, mirage heat. No insects. No birds. Even my phone lost signal like the air refused to carry a voice. That first night, I slept in my truck because the bedroom felt rehearsed for someone else. The sky went purple then black, and the farmhouse pulled tight around itself like a secret. I should have driven back to town. I should have called a friend. Instead, I cracked the window and listened. That's how I heard the breathing. At first I blamed wind. But the trees were still and the sound rose from the earth, slow and damp, like a sleeping animal exhaling under the floorboards of the world. In. Out. A pause long enough to make me hold my own lungs hostage. I turned the key to accessory. The dash lights glowed weakly, and in that small electric comfort I told myself, raccoons, maybe. Underground water. A tractor far away. Then the truck shifted. Not much, just a polite nudge as if a large person had leaned against the bumper. I sat upright, pulse in my teeth. Another nudge, this one accompanied by a soft skitter under the chassis, not claws, roots. I know how that sounds. But every nerve in me pictured tendrils reaching, feeling, learning the shape of the metal I trusted to keep me safe. I made myself get out. Stupid bravado. The night swallowed me past the dome light. The breathing deepened, closer, as if the field had rolled right up to the tires. I crouched, shining my phone flashlight beneath the truck. The beam caught dust and something else, filaments as thin as hair trailing from the wheel well, retracting with insect speed when the light touched them. I yelped and dropped the phone. The beam spun wild, landed on the back stoop, and on the door, which was now standing open. I hadn't left it that way. I stepped toward the house, because fear, in me, takes the form of curiosity with a knife's edge. That's when the porch boards creaked under a weight I couldn't see. One step. Another. The door swung wider, inviting or hungry. From the field behind me came a wet, eager inhale. Something in the dark doorway whispered my name, my mother's exact voice, though she's been dead 5 years. If stories like this pull you in, subscribe now. I'll show you what I found inside that house, and why nothing has grown here since the summer of 1988. Morning light didn't make the house safer. It only revealed how wrong everything looked when compared to memory. My uncle had always been neat, at least that's what my mother told me, but the kitchen drawers were half open and the hallway wallpaper peeled like it had been gnawed. I brewed stale coffee from a tin left on the counter, and the bitter taste felt like permission to keep going deeper. I needed proof I hadn't imagined the voice at the door. Proof that what I felt under the truck wasn't my nerves inventing shapes. So I started where my uncle would have started, with his papers. Probate had dumped 2 boxes of files in the front room, tax returns, insurance policies, and a ledger that should have recorded every harvest. Only it didn't. The book was missing between the years 1987 and 1990. Those were the exact years neighbors swore the drought nearly wiped the county from the map. I found instead a bundle of receipts for bulk seed, tons of it purchased, none of it yielding. Each invoice ended with the same scrawl, "Return to soil." No explanation. No refund. Just that phrase, repeated like a mantra across half a dozen yellowed slips. I pulled on boots and went to the fields, half expecting to see some hint of the previous night. The rows were still dead flat, not a bird daring to scratch the surface. My truck tires left shallow impressions, but the soil itself seemed to push back, trying to erase them. I walked to the well at the center of the property. My uncle had capped it with a thick circle of fresh concrete, newer than anything else around. No handle, no bucket. Just a scar in the earth. A neighbor must have seen me, because an old man appeared at the fence line, hat low, eyes suspicious. He didn't wave. He only said, "Best not to dig." His voice carried strange weight in the hot stillness. When I asked about the well, he shook his head and walked off without another word. Back inside, I noticed something I had missed before. On the dining room wall, there was a framed family photo, Thanksgiving, 1988. My uncle stood stiffly beside a table full of food. Yet outside the window in the background, the fields looked just as barren as they did now. A harvest celebration with nothing harvested. My stomach turned. That night, I tried to sleep in the bedroom instead of the truck. I kept a flashlight on the nightstand and the ledger receipt spread across the floor like wards against something I didn't understand. I told myself the house was only wood and nail. But around midnight, a sound rose from beneath the floorboards, not breathing this time, but something thinner. A whisper. A hiss of syllables half-formed. I crouched, pressing my ear to the wood. It was my name again, stretched and distorted, syllables dragging like wet cloth. Then another word followed, ledger. I scrambled back, heart jackhammering. The receipts on the floor fluttered though no window was open. And then, in the silence that followed, a page slid out from beneath the bed. Old, lined paper, covered in my uncle's handwriting. At the bottom was one last entry, dated the week he died. Final offering failed. It knows. The paper grew damp in my hands, as if the soil itself was seeping through the ink. I didn't sleep after finding that page. Dawn came pale and heavy, pressing against the curtains as if it wanted to enter but didn't dare. My coffee went untouched. Instead, I kept staring at the words, final offering failed. It knows. If the farmhouse carried a curse, or something worse, then the soil was its heartbeat. I needed to test it, prove to myself that this wasn't superstition, that there was something measurable. I drove into town and bought 2 small packets of seed, corn and beans. Ordinary, healthy, sealed. On impulse, I also grabbed a bag of potting soil. Back at the house, I set up an experiment in the kitchen. 2 trays, identical. One filled with the potting soil, the other with the farmhouse earth I scooped from outside. I planted the seeds carefully, pressing them into their beds like children tucked in. Then I left them by the window, side by side, the morning sun spilling equally across both. By evening, the potting soil tray already showed tiny signs of life, green nubs pushing upward, eager. But in the tray filled with the farmhouse soil, the seeds looked darker, swollen, as though they had been burned. A smell rose from them too, faintly metallic, the same taste I'd felt when I first pinched the dirt between my fingers. That night, the whispering came again. Not under the floorboards this time, but from the fields themselves. I stood at the back door and listened. The rows shifted in the moonlight, though there was no wind. Something was moving beneath, something with patience. The earth pulsed faintly, a rise and fall in rhythm with the whispers. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my keys and never look back. But the truth clawed harder than fear. My uncle's death, the barren land, the ledger with its cryptic entries, it all formed a puzzle that wouldn't let me go. The next morning, I checked the trays again. The potting soil seeds had doubled in size overnight, bright green shoots pushing high. The farmhouse soil tray. Black sludge. The beans had rotted in a single night, their skins split and leaking a dark ooze that stained the ceramic. I gagged at the smell, acrid and sharp like rusted nails. I heard footsteps then. Not from the hall, but right outside the window where the trays sat. Heavy, deliberate steps on the dry grass. I turned slowly, but no one was there. Only the rows of the dead field, stretching endless, silent. Yet the window glass held faint condensation, as if something had leaned close to watch. I carried the ruined tray outside, determined to dump it. But when I tipped it over, the soil resisted. It clung to the ceramic, sticking like it had grown roots into the tray itself. I banged it hard against the porch rail until the mess fell in clumps. And as it landed, I saw something impossible. The blackened seeds had faces. Small, malformed impressions, eyes squeezed shut, mouths open as if mid-scream. I stumbled back, bile rising, nearly dropping the whole tray. In the silence that followed, I swore I heard laughter, low and childlike, rising from the dirt at my feet. I slammed the door shut and locked it, every nerve on fire. Upstairs, the family photo from 1988 hung crooked now, as if someone had touched it during the night. The children in the picture, I hadn't noticed them before, looked blurred, smudged. Almost like the faces in the seeds. That night, as I lay awake, I heard scratching inside the walls, tiny, frantic scratches, and then a whisper right at my ear, "Plant more." By the fourth day, I stopped pretending I was in control. The farmhouse was no longer just walls and memory, it had become a stage where something unseen moved freely, using me as both audience and actor. It began with the whistling. At first, I thought it was wind, though the air was perfectly still. A thin, high note drifted through the house, starting in one room and then slipping to the next, like someone pacing and softly blowing through their teeth. When I chased it, the sound always receded, always just out of reach, tugging me deeper into the hallways. By noon, the whistling circled the house outside, steady, deliberate, as if something was walking the perimeter. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring through the window, but the fields didn't move, and no figure broke the line of the horizon. That night, the air pressed heavy on my chest. I tried to sleep, flashlight on the nightstand, but the whistling seeped through the walls again, closer than before. It didn't float this time, it marched. Slow. Measured. Step, whistle. Step, whistle. Around and around. I pressed my palm to the wall, and the vibration ran straight through my bones. Not wind. Not human. Something else. When the sound finally stopped, silence seemed louder than before. I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, I woke with the feeling of being watched. My room was dark, the flashlight dead. But I didn't need light to know something stood at the foot of my bed. I held my breath, straining. The boards groaned faintly, not under weight but under presence, like wood bowing to respect an unseen guest. My skin crawled as the air shifted, carrying a faint scent, wet earth and rust. Then I felt it. Not hands. Not claws. Something pressed against the blanket, a slow indentation tracing up toward my legs. I jerked upright, grabbed the dead flashlight and swung it through the dark. Nothing. But when I turned toward the window, my heart froze. Boot prints. Clear as day, stamped in the dust on the wooden floorboards. They began at the door, circled the bed, and stopped right beside me. I blinked, and in that instant, they darkened, filling with damp soil as though the ground itself had risen through the floor. I stumbled back against the headboard, while choking my throat. The prints didn't fade. They spread, one by one, across the room, each new step forming without a body to make it. Slowly, they moved toward the wall opposite the bed. And then they kept going. The steps climbed straight up the plaster, impossibly, until the last print hovered near the ceiling above me. Soil fell in soft drifts onto the blanket, staining it with dark streaks. The whistling returned, faint but unmistakable, coming not from outside, not from the hallway, but from directly above my head. I couldn't move. Couldn't scream. The sound dropped in pitch, low and hungry, vibrating through the ceiling beams until it rattled the glass in the photo frames. That was when the overhead light flickered once and died, plunging me into a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse hammering. In the blackness, a voice no louder than breath whispered inches from my ear, "You're in my bed." I didn't leave the house the next morning. I should have. Any sane person would have packed up, called the lawyer, and burned the deed. But fear had shifted into obsession. The soil, the whispers, the prints on the ceiling, they weren't just haunting me. They were trying to tell me something. And I needed to know what. I searched the house from attic to basement. Dust clung to my hair and throat, and the air in the storage rooms carried that same metallic tang. It was in the attic, under a trunk of moth-eaten blankets, that I found it. A microcassette recorder. The kind my uncle used in the 80s, with one tape still inside. The plastic was cracked, and the play button stuck halfway, but it whirred to life when I pressed it. Static filled the air, scratching at my nerves like claws. Then his voice, rasped, weak, and frantic. "It won't take seed anymore. The soil rejects. It wants blood now. Don't feed it blood. Don't." The tape clicked off, as if cut short mid-sentence. My hand shook as I ejected it, flipping to the other side. The hiss returned, followed by heavy breathing. Then, faintly. "If anyone inherits this house, don't stay past the 5th night. By then, it knows you." I froze. By my count, tonight would be my 5th night. I shoved the recorder into my pocket and stumbled down the attic ladder, heart pounding against my ribs. Every board of the house creaked with me, like it was listening. The fields outside lay flat, as lifeless as ever. Yet when I looked closer, I realized something had changed. A new shape stood at the center of the barren rows. Tall. Thin. Ragged. A scarecrow. I hadn't seen it before. I would have. It wasn't facing the fields either. It was facing me. Facing the house. My chest tightened as I stepped outside. The air buzzed like a swarm though no insects flew. The scarecrow leaned slightly, its burlap head tilted, straw arms outstretched. And the smell, iron and rot, riding the hot breeze, struck me before I reached the fence. The closer I came, the clearer the wrongness. The straw in its chest wasn't straw at all. It was dried roots, tangled and twisted, still clotted with soil. Something dark stained the burlap sack where the heart should be. I turned back toward the porch. For a moment, I swore I saw someone standing there. A woman. My mother's outline, pale dress, hair spilling across her shoulders the way it had when I was a child. But when I blinked, she was gone. Only the open doorway remained. The recorder in my pocket crackled suddenly, though I hadn't pressed play. A whisper bled through the speaker, not my uncle's voice this time, but something deeper. Lower. Hungry. 5 nights. Yours. The words dissolved into static, and I dropped the recorder onto the dirt. The scarecrow's head twitched, ever so slightly, toward the sound. The air grew colder, unnatural for summer. My breath fogged in front of me. The fields pulsed, faint waves rolling through the soil like a heartbeat. That was when the scarecrow's arm moved. Just a fraction, straw, or roots, cracking as it lifted one hand in the smallest of gestures. A wave. A welcome. I stumbled back onto the porch, nearly tripping over the step. The door slammed shut behind me without my touch. From outside, the scarecrow's voice rasped through the walls, carrying the same words from the tape, "Don't feed it blood." I didn't leave the farmhouse on the fifth night, even after hearing the scarecrow's rasp. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the recorder in front of me, staring at it as if it might explain itself. The words, "Don't feed it blood," echoed again and again in my skull until they almost felt like my own thoughts. By morning, I was shaking. I needed answers. I tore through drawers, cabinets, and trunks until my fingers bled from splinters. Finally, inside an old cedar chest in the upstairs hallway, I found a stack of notebooks tied together with twine. My uncle's handwriting crawled across the covers. Most were mundane farm notes, seed counts, weather records, repair costs, but one was different. Its cover bore no title. Inside, the ink slanted frantic, lines scrawled over lines like he had written in panic. Dates ran down the margins: July 1988, August 1988, September 1988. Every entry circled around the same theme: the drought. Crops dying. Wells drying. Neighbors desperate. They say no prayer will be answered unless the ground itself is fed. They call it a bargain. I thought they were drunk. But the rain came the night after they tried. It came. I turned the pages faster, my throat tight. At first, only animals. Goats. Dogs. It took them easy. The soil opened, swallowed, and in exchange the rain fell. I told myself it was coincidence. But every time the sky stayed dry too long, they brought more. Then the list grew. Names. Names I knew. One scratched off each month. The ink smeared as if written with shaking hands. At the bottom of one page was a phrase underlined 3 times. The earth doesn't want crops. It wants us. I dropped the notebook, bile rising. My uncle hadn't just been a victim. He had been part of it. That night, I dreamt, or thought I did. I stood in the barren fields, rain soaking my shoulders. Around me, shadowed figures dug into the dirt with bare hands, chanting words too old for me to understand. Each one carried something, bundles wrapped in cloth, heavy, dripping. They laid the bundles in the rows. The soil quivered, then opened, swallowing everything whole. When I woke, my sheets were wet with mud. Real mud. The smell of iron clung to me. I staggered downstairs and found the scarecrow gone from the field. The post stood empty, the burlap sack discarded, still stained with dark patches. In the center of the sack was something worse, a human tooth, wedged in the weave of the fabric. I wanted to run, but my body betrayed me. I carried the sack inside and spread it on the kitchen table like evidence. As I touched it, a memory I didn't own forced its way into my head: men standing in a circle in 1988, my uncle among them, his face pale with fear but his hand steady as he placed a knife against a calf's throat. And above them, the sky split with thunder. The notebook's last entry burned in my mind: one more. Then it will sleep. From the back door came a low, rhythmic sound, the unmistakable drip of water hitting wood. But when I opened it, the porch wasn't wet with rain. It was wet with blood. The porch boards gleamed red beneath the morning light. At first, I thought my eyes were lying, that it was only the rising sun painting the wood. But when I touched it, the truth clung to my fingers, thick, metallic, and undeniable. Blood. There were no footprints. No trail leading away. Only the steady rhythm of drops falling from nowhere, staining the planks until they darkened. I stumbled back inside, scrubbing my hands raw in the sink, my breath catching on the copper taste in the air. I needed answers beyond my uncle's frantic scrawls. If there was a bargain, someone else in this town must have known. Someone must have carried it on. So I drove. The nearest neighbor's farmhouse sagged on the horizon, shingles curling, paint gray with neglect. The old man I had seen days earlier appeared again, this time leaning against his fence, watching my truck roll up the dusty lane. "You've been digging," he said before I could open my mouth. I swallowed hard. I found his notebooks. His jaw tightened. "Should have burned them." "Was it you?" I asked. "Was it all of you back then?" The silence stretched until the cicadas seemed to pause. Finally, he nodded once, a tiny crack in his armor. "We were starving," he whispered. "Fields dead, livestock dying, kids coughing from thirst. We prayed, but nothing came. Then someone remembered the old stories. Said the land listens if you speak the right way. If you give it the right price." My stomach churned. Animals first. He didn't deny it. His eyes flicked toward the barren stretch behind my uncle's property. It rained. Enough to save us a season. But the soil remembered the taste. The sky turned stingy again. And that's when, he trailed off. I pressed him. "The names in the ledger. Those weren't accidents, were they?" The old man's hand shook as he adjusted his hat. "Debt doesn't vanish, boy. We gave what it asked. Some neighbors more willing than others." He met my gaze, a flicker of guilt and something darker behind his eyes. "Your uncle wanted out. He thought he could trick it. Replace blood with seed. But the soil knows the difference." I staggered back to my truck, bile rising. The man called after me, "It doesn't forget. And now it's watching you." That night, the air pressed heavy again. I tried to barricade the doors, nailing boards across the windows, but the whistling found its way in. Low at first, then louder, threading through every crack, every nail, until the whole house seemed to breathe with it. I lit every lamp, desperate for light. That's when I saw it, scratched into the wallpaper near the dining room window. Names. Dozens of them, carved by a desperate hand. Some I recognized from the notebooks. Others were strangers. All but one were crossed out. The final name sat at the bottom. Fresh, the plaster dust still clinging to the letters. My own. The lamps flickered, and in the trembling glow I saw it, the wallpaper bulging outward, as if the house itself was swelling to breathe my name. I told myself I wouldn't open it. That some doors were meant to stay shut, especially when the neighbors warned against digging. But denial couldn't erase the sound that came each night, the wet rustle of roots beneath the floorboards, like veins crawling closer to the surface. The cellar door was padlocked. The lock wasn't old, it was shiny, almost new, like someone had replaced it not long before my uncle died. I found a hammer and chisel in the shed. My hands shook as I struck, each clang echoing too loud in the silence of the fields. Finally, the lock snapped. The air that rushed up from below was colder than it had any right to be. It smelled of soil, yes, but layered with something fouler, rot, mildew, and a faint sweet note of decay. I clicked on a flashlight and descended the narrow stairs. The walls weren't stone. They weren't wood. They were roots. Thick, braided roots, packed so tightly together they formed the structure itself. They pulsed faintly when the light hit them, as though shrinking from brightness. My stomach lurched. Embedded between the roots were objects, shards of pottery, scraps of fabric, bones. Small bones. I stumbled forward, gagging. The flashlight beam caught a doll's head, porcelain cracked, half swallowed by tendrils that wrapped it like loving fingers. Next to it, a shoe so small it could only have belonged to a child. The roots shifted when I touched the wall, flexing like muscle beneath skin. A low groan rippled through the chamber, not from above, but from the roots themselves. My name shivered through the sound, whispered in dozens of voices overlapping, young and old, male and female. I swung the light across the floor. At the center lay a shallow pit, lined with black earth. Inside, more bones. Too many. Arranged in patterns, circles, spirals. Each set entwined with roots that had grown through them, threading rib cages, weaving femurs like loom work. At the edge of the pit lay something newer. My uncle's pocketknife. Its blade rusted red, its handle cracked. But next to it was something worse, a page from his notebook, folded carefully, almost reverently. I opened it with trembling hands. The ink had bled, but the words were still legible. I thought if I gave it only myself, it would end. But it doesn't want to end. It wants more. Always more. It's not the land that's cursed. It's what we planted in it. The floor vibrated under my knees. The roots twitched, curling upward as if to taste the air. One lashed against my boot, leaving a streak of damp earth. Another brushed my ankle. I bolted for the stairs, but the wood groaned as if weighed down, slowing my escape. Halfway up, the flashlight flickered. In that strobe of light and dark, I saw shapes forming in the roots. Faces. Dozens of them, stretching out of the wood, mouths open in eternal scream. Some looked like adults. Others, heartbreakingly, like children. The last thing I heard before slamming the cellar door shut behind me was a sound that stole the breath from my chest. Laughter. High-pitched. Childlike. And far too close. When I turned back toward the kitchen, muddy footprints, small, barefoot, led across the floor and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. I followed the footprints until they faded into nothing, my breath loud in the silence. Every step felt wrong, like the floorboards were rising to meet me rather than the other way around. I slept in short bursts on the couch that night, the cellar door nailed shut with everything I could find. But the laughter still seeped through the walls. By morning, my resolve broke. I needed someone, anyone, to tell me what was happening. So I drove back to the neighbor's place. The old man was waiting, as if he had known I would come. His eyes were sunken, his shirt stained with sweat and soil. "You opened it, didn't you?" he rasped. I didn't answer. The silence told him enough. He sighed, shoulders sagging. "Then it's awake again." I slammed my hand against his fence. "What is it? What did you people do?" The old man's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the line of my uncle's field sat flat and gray against the sky. "We didn't have a choice," he whispered. "That summer, no rain, no crops, no money. People were dying. We prayed for weeks, but prayers don't feed children. Then someone brought an old book. Said our grandparents' used to do it. A bargain. Blood for rain." My stomach twisted. "Animals." He nodded once, slow. "At first. And it worked. The next day, clouds rolled in like salvation. But the earth, it remembered. It wanted more. We gave it goats, pigs, even a horse once. But after a while, the storms came only when we gave it something greater. Something human." His voice cracked on the last word. I staggered back. "You killed people." "Not killed," he said quickly, desperately, though the lie trembled in his throat. "Offered. They were chosen. Some sick. Some old. Some who wouldn't be missed." His hands shook on the fence post. "Your uncle, he wanted to end it. He fought us. Tried planting instead. But the soil knew the difference. That's why he capped the well. That's where we took them. The well." My chest tightened. The slab of fresh concrete at the heart of the property suddenly felt like a gravestone. The old man leaned closer, voice dropping to a hiss. "You can't undo it. You think burning the notebooks or leaving the house will help? It won't. The soil knows you now. It doesn't just want blood. It wants your blood." I drove back in a haze, the neighbor's words rattling in my head like stones in a tin can. When I pulled into the driveway, the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. The house loomed with a weight it hadn't carried before, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar as if waiting for me. Inside, the footprints from the night before had multiplied. Dozens now, overlapping, weaving trails up the stairs and across the ceilings. Every room I entered carried the faint smell of rain that never fell. I went to the window overlooking the well. The slab of concrete shimmered in the heat, and for the first time I swore I saw it move, just a ripple, like water beneath stone. That night, I left every light on, but the house grew darker anyway. The air vibrated with a low hum, too deep to be wind, too steady to be imagination. And then the whisper came again. Not from the walls. Not from beneath the floor. From directly under the concrete slab. The voice from the well spoke in my mother's tone again, this time saying just 2 words, "Come closer." I told myself I wouldn't do it. That I'd let the concrete slab keep its secrets buried. But once you hear your dead mother's voice calling from beneath the earth, reason becomes irrelevant. Curiosity doesn't whisper, it screams. The moon was thin that night, a sliver of silver barely bright enough to cut through the dark. I carried a crowbar and flashlight to the center of the barren field, where the well sat sealed under its round of concrete. Every step felt heavier, as though the soil were resisting me, tugging at my boots. The closer I came, the more the air changed. It grew damp, colder, and the smell hit me before I even touched the slab, wet stone, rust, and something metallic, sharp as old blood. My hands trembled as I wedged the crowbar beneath the edge of the concrete. It resisted, but only for a moment. Then it shifted with a groan that echoed through the ground. The slab wasn't just sitting on the well, it was being held down. And something beneath it wanted out. As the concrete cracked, the voice returned. Softer this time. "Son." My chest collapsed inward. It was her. My mother's voice, sweet and warm, the way it sounded when she tucked me into bed as a child. I clenched my eyes shut, telling myself it was a trick. But the sound seeped through my bones, bypassing logic. I pried harder, sweat slicking my grip. With one final shove, the slab tilted, rolling just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness below. The smell burst upward, so strong I gagged. My flashlight beam pierced the opening, but the light seemed to drown, swallowed by black that refused to reflect. And then something moved. Not water. Not soil. Something pale, rippling like flesh. It pressed against the inside of the well as though the darkness itself had skin. Fingers, or something like fingers, spread against the stone, too long, too many joints, slick with fluid. They twitched, stretching toward the light. The voice rose again, louder, more insistent. "Come closer, let me see you." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The soil shifted under my feet, softening, sucking me toward the opening like it wanted me inside. I scrambled, clawing at the ground, until I regained footing. The voice turned harsh then, its sweetness cracking like old paint. "Don't make me wait. You belong here. You're the seed. The final seed." The word seed froze my blood. The ruined beans, the black sludge, the faces in the husks, all of it surged back at once. My uncle hadn't failed the soil. He had stalled it. Postponed it. And now it was hungry again. Hungry for me. I shoved the slab back into place with every ounce of strength I had. The ground shuddered, resisting, but finally yielded. The well's voice muffled, sinking into silence. But not before I heard one last whisper, faint, muffled, but clear enough to carve into my mind. "I'll climb through the roots. You can't seal those." I staggered back to the farmhouse, body shaking, breath shallow. Inside, every light flickered in unison. And from deep in the cellar, where roots wove bone into walls, a wet rustling began to spread. The roots in the cellar groaned, and from beneath the floorboards, something whispered my name, this time in my own voice. I didn't sleep after the well spoke with my own voice. I sat at the kitchen table with every lamp on, the recorder, the notebooks, and the burlap sack from the scarecrow spread around me like evidence in a trial no jury would ever believe. But one thing gnawed louder than fear: the missing ledger. My uncle had kept records of everything, even when his sanity slipped. The harvest books were incomplete, but that wasn't an accident. Something was hidden. Something meant for whoever inherited this nightmare. At dawn, I searched again. Every drawer, every trunk. The cellar was out of the question, the roots pressed so loud against the door I swore I could hear them breathing. Finally, in the attic, behind a false panel in the wall, I found a flat, leather-bound book wrapped in oilcloth. The ledger. I unwrapped it with trembling hands. The cover was cracked, pages yellowed, but the ink inside burned black as though written yesterday. It wasn't rows of crops or expenses. It was names. Dozens of them. Each page held a date, a short description, and then a name. Some were neighbors I remembered from childhood visits. Others were strangers. Each entry ended with a single word: offered. I flipped further, and the names grew darker. The town doctor. The sheriff. A schoolteacher. Dates lined up perfectly with accidents I remembered hearing about as a kid: car crashes, sudden illnesses, drownings. All written here as though none of it was chance. At the bottom of each page was a tally. Rainfall in inches. Crop yield in bushels. Every death exchanged for harvest, every life bartered for rain. By the time I reached the final pages, my stomach churned so hard I thought I'd vomit. The most recent entry was from just before my uncle died. August 1990. Failed offering. Soil angry. Rain withheld. It knows I am next. Below it, no name. Only a half-written word, scratched so deep into the paper it tore through. Nephew. My breath stuttered. The ledger trembled in my hands. He hadn't left the farm to me out of care or inheritance. He had left it because the bargain had marked me decades ago. A floorboard groaned behind me. I spun, heart in my throat. The attic was empty, dust swirling in the sunbeam. But when I looked back at the ledger, fresh words were appearing across the page. Ink bleeding into parchment, letters forming slow and deliberate, as though written by an invisible hand. You. Now. I slammed the book shut and bolted down the attic ladder. But the house was no safer. The wallpaper names I'd seen in the dining room had changed. My own name wasn't at the bottom anymore, it was repeated. Over and over. Filling the walls in uneven scrawls. The bulbs overhead burst one by one, glass raining onto the floor. In the sudden dark, the ledger grew hot under my arm, as though the book itself was alive. And from outside, I heard the impossible, raindrops tapping the windows. But when I looked, it wasn't water streaking down the glass. It was red. Thick. Slow. The blood rain lasted less than an hour, but the stain of it clung to the glass even after the drops dried. I sat frozen in the dining room, the ledger hot under my arm, my name scrawled 100 times on the walls. There was no denying it anymore, the farm didn't want me to inherit. It wanted me to be harvested. So I tried to leave. At sunrise, I shoved the ledger into a satchel, grabbed my keys, and ran for the truck. The air outside was heavier than ever, as if the atmosphere itself were pressing down to keep me from breathing. The fields didn't look flat anymore, they swelled, rose rising like ribs under taut skin. I cranked the ignition. The engine sputtered once, then died. I tried again, pumping the gas, cursing under my breath. Dead. When I looked up, the rearview mirror showed something that froze me solid, the scarecrow. It stood behind the truck, though I'd seen its post empty the night before. Its head tilted, burlap sagging, roots spilling from its sleeves. I bolted out the driver's side, heart hammering. If the truck wouldn't move, I'd go on foot. The road stretched pale toward the horizon, but the further I ran, the more it bent. Not like a curve, but like a loop. Within minutes, I was staring at the farmhouse again, its dark windows watching me. I screamed, hurling the satchel at the door. I don't want this. Take it back. The ledger spilled onto the porch, pages fluttering open. The writing shifted before my eyes, black ink writhing into new words. Too late. Debt is yours now. The ground pulsed under my boots, and the earth inhaled. That slow, wet breathing again, but faster this time, like anticipation. The fields rippled toward the house, soil rising in waves as if the land itself was crawling closer. I ran back inside and tried the phone, though I already knew it was useless. Dead line, nothing but static. I pulled the curtains tight, nailed boards across the windows, dragged furniture against the doors. But the whistling found its way in again, circling, taunting, seeping through the walls as if the house itself were hollow lungs. Every light flickered, then burned out one by one. I was left in darkness with the sound of the soil pressing against the foundation. I lit a lantern and opened the ledger again. Maybe there was something in the earlier pages, some hint of escape, some note my uncle had hidden. My eyes scanned desperate lines, but there was no salvation. Only one final phrase, scrawled across the inside back cover. If you can't give it what it wants, burn it. My throat went dry. Burn it? The farm? The fields? Or the book itself? A sound rose from beneath the floorboards, roots dragging, searching, climbing. The lantern flame stretched tall, quivering, as if reaching for oxygen that wasn't there. And then the cellar door rattled against its nails. Once. Twice. Then a steady pounding, each slam shaking dust from the ceiling beams. I pressed the ledger tight to my chest and whispered into the dark, though no one was left to hear me, I won't feed it. The pounding stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought I'd won. Then, from the front window, I saw movement. The scarecrow again, standing in the middle of the field. But now, there were others beside it. Dozens. Figures rising from the rows, their bodies made of soil and root, their faces carved from nothing but hunger. The house held its breath, and so did I. Outside, the rows of soil swelled and shifted, birthing shapes that should never have existed. Dozens of figures stood in the moonlight, their bodies stitched from roots and soil, faces half-formed, eyeless, mouths frozen in silent hunger. And at their center loomed the scarecrow, taller now, its arms spread wide as if conducting the scene. The whistling that had haunted me for days no longer circled the house, it pulsed from within me, each exhale carrying the sound. My ribs rattled with it, my throat raw from resisting. The land wasn't just outside anymore. It had moved in. I stumbled back, clutching the ledger. You can't have me, I whispered, though my voice cracked under the weight of fear. The figures didn't move at first. They only stared, if staring was possible without eyes. Then, as one, they stepped forward. The ground quivered with every movement. I barricaded myself in the living room, the lantern flickering weakly, shadows swelling against the walls. The pounding from the cellar door resumed, harder this time, nails shrieking as they bent. The wallpaper bulged, roots pushing through like veins bursting skin. The ledger vibrated in my hands, its pages fluttering though no wind stirred. New words inked themselves across the parchment in frantic, jagged script. One more. Then it will sleep. My uncle's last words. His plan to end it. But he had failed. A crash thundered from the hallway as the cellar door finally gave way. The stench of wet earth and iron filled the air. I bolted up the stairs, lantern in hand, my chest tight with every breath. Shadows writhed on the walls, stretching into clawed shapes that grasped for me as I passed. I locked myself in the upstairs bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. Outside the window, the field glowed faintly, soil rippling like an ocean in storm. The scarecrow raised one hand, and the figures obeyed, spreading toward the house like an advancing tide. Then came the sound that broke me. Rain. Not water, not salvation, thick, red droplets pattered against the glass, streaking the window in long, bloody trails. The ledger burned hot in my grip, the ink crawling like ants across the paper, forming new words. Burn the root. Burn it now. My mind spun. Burn what? The house? The field? Myself? The dresser shuddered as something heavy slammed into the door. A voice hissed through the crack, low and many at once, overlapping like a chorus. Seed. Seed. You are the final seed. The wallpaper tore as roots thrust through, writhing across the ceiling, dripping soil onto the floor. I backed against the far wall, lantern shaking in my hand. My reflection in the cracked mirror looked wrong, eyes too dark, mouth moving though I wasn't speaking. From below, the cellar groaned, a cavernous exhale that shook the entire house. The figures outside pressed closer, their forms merging with the walls, with the roof, as if the farm itself was swallowing me whole. I dropped the lantern. The flame spread across the floorboards, hungry, crackling. For the first time, the voices faltered, hissing as smoke filled the room. But before the fire took hold, a whisper rose above it all, clear and calm, like a lullaby. My mother's voice again. Burn it, son. Burn everything. Or it will never stop. The flames leapt higher, and through the smoke I saw the scarecrow climb the porch, roots dragging, burlap head bending toward the window, as if it were smiling at me. The house burned like it had been waiting to all along. Flames licked the walls, devouring wallpaper covered in names, curling beams into black skeletons. Smoke poured upward, choking the night sky. I coughed hard, stumbling down the stairs with the ledger clutched to my chest, every step slick with ash and sweat. The voices screamed as the fire spread, hundreds of them, children and elders, neighbors long dead, all howling in one long wail of rage. The roots writhed in the cellar, twisting and snapping, trying to crawl free. For a moment, I thought the fire might be enough. That maybe the nightmare could end here. But then the earth itself shifted. The soil outside rippled in waves, surging toward the house. The figures born of dirt and root pressed forward through the smoke, their eyeless faces glaring with accusation. And in their center, the scarecrow still stood, arms raised, straw and roots blazing but unburned. The ledger in my hand grew so hot it blistered my skin. The ink bled, spelling out its last command in jagged, fiery strokes. Burn it on the ridge. I didn't think. I ran. Out the door, past the porch now crumbling into embers, through the rows of barren earth that pulsed and breathed beneath my boots. The scarecrow screeched behind me, its voice like tearing metal, the chorus of the dead roaring with it. But I kept running. At the edge of the property, the land rose into a ridge, a bare hill that overlooked the farmhouse below. My uncle's ridge. I remembered him standing here once when I was a boy, staring out at the fields with a look I hadn't understood then. Now I knew, he had been weighing the cost. I staggered to the top, wind whipping the smoke into my face. The figures climbed after me, their bodies breaking apart with every step, reforming from soil as if the land itself carried them. The scarecrow followed last, its burlap face twisting, its voice shrieking my name. I dropped to my knees, ledger open, pages fluttering like wings. My lantern flame was nearly dead, but I thrust it into the book. Fire roared to life, swallowing parchment, devouring ink. The voices howled louder than the fire itself, shrieks tearing through the night as the ledger burned. The ground convulsed. Roots shot upward around the ridge, thrashing, clawing at the sky. The farmhouse below collapsed inward, swallowed by the earth as though it had never been. The scarecrow fell to its knees, burlap catching, roots blackening, until it was nothing but ash scattered by the wind. And then, silence. The soil stilled. The air cleared. For the first time in decades, I smelled rain that wasn't tainted. Real rain. It rolled in heavy, cooling, soaking the ridge as the fire smoldered to embers. I stood alone, soaked and trembling, staring at the ruin of the farmhouse below. The land looked different. Empty, yes, but free. Or so I wanted to believe. Because when I looked down at the ridge, the charred remains of the ledger still lay smoking. The cover curled inward, blackened, but one scrap of page survived the fire. I bent to pick it up, my fingers shaking. 4 words stared back at me, unburned. Debt never ends. Replanted. Lightning split the horizon. The fields below shifted faintly, like something just beneath the surface had rolled over in its sleep. And then the first sprouts appeared. Tiny green shoots, rising through soil that had never grown a thing in 30 years. For a moment, my heart leapt with hope. But then I saw them more clearly. The shoots weren't corn. They weren't beans. They looked like fingers, small and pale, pushing through the dirt to reach the air. As I stumbled back from the ridge, the new crop kept rising, row after row, until the field below waved with hundreds of pale hands reaching skyward.